Most coaches I speak to can tell me what their athletes did in training last week, the drills they ran, the distances they covered, the gym sessions they completed, but ask them what actually made their athletes faster, the specific physical quality that moved the needle, and the answer gets vague very fast. Because speed improvement isn't random, it comes down to 3 physical qualities, and if you're not deliberately targeting the right one for each athlete, you're collecting sessions instead of building speed. Before we get into it, if you want a practical tool that helps you turn what we cover in this series into a system your athletes can actually feel on the field, then grab the Field Speed Toolkit. It's free. It includes a speed drill audit sheet, a plug and play training week, and the 5 transfer filters that separate coaches who get results from coaches who just get tired athletes. The link is in the description. Grab it now and follow along. So the first quality, and the one that catches most coaches out, is force. Not how much force your athletes can produce, but how quickly they can produce it. And the distinction is everything. Here's what happens in most programs. The gym becomes the answer to speed. Athletes squat, they deadlift, they hit personal bests, and the numbers go up. But out on the field, the speed doesn't follow. And coaches are left scratching their heads wondering why their strongest athletes aren't their fastest ones. The answer lies in this curve. On one axis, we have force, and on the other, we have time. And what this shows is that it takes a lot of time to produce the maximum amount of force that you can. But sprinting doesn't give you time. Every ground contact in a sprint is somewhere between 80 and 120 milliseconds. That's it. So if your athletes can only access their force slowly in about 3 seconds, the way a heavy back squats trains them to, they've already lost a 20-meter race, and their force is completely unavailable when they need it most. So what actually drives speed is rate of force development, not the peak of the curve, but how steeply it rises in those first critical milliseconds of ground contact. The athlete who gets to 60% of their maximum force in 80 milliseconds will always beat the athlete who needs 200 milliseconds to get there, regardless of who is stronger overall. So stop chasing maximum force and start training how quickly the force is expressed. That's the shift that actually shows up on the field. Now, force gets you into the ground, but what happens next is where most athletes leak all the speed that they just produced. So your athlete has produced force quickly and driven it into the ground. That's the first quality sorted. But here's where most coaches lose speed. They don't even know they're losing. Because what happens in that moment the foot hits the ground determines whether the force will actually drive the athlete forward or disappears. Think about what sprinting does. You compress it and it returns the energy. That's elasticity. Now think about what happens when you compress something and it doesn't spring. That's something soft, so it deforms. So what we're talking about is, as this athlete is moving in this direction trying to accelerate, as that ball of the foot hits the ground, if this ankle joint is not strong enough or compliant enough, what's going to happen is it's going to actually flex forward. The joint angle will not stay stiff as we need it to do. So what's going to happen is all this force that's being generated from the posterior chain and the bum gets driven back down, and then that joint can't tolerate it. So ultimately, the athlete ends up doing something called deformation. So the ground will hit, the ankle will drive back, the net speed of that athlete we're accelerating through will actually decline, and they won't be able to compete because the energy doesn't come back. You may have seen it in many of your athletes when they're doing acceleration. Their ankles are floppy, or in their sled marches. That is what happens. So just as fast as that force is produced from here, it disappears in the same way. And that's exactly what's happening when athletes do lack elasticity and the reactivity on ground contact. Let me draw out another example for you. Here's an athlete with good ground contact management. We'll take this one in an upright, figure 4, maximum velocity position. Okay, so this athlete is on the ground doing fantastic. They've got a slight knee bend and they're able to return the force really well. Now we take an athlete who can't manage good ground contact. As this foot will strike and hit the ground, okay, the ankle joint that we talked about will collapse. Then what happens, we'll get a greater knee bend and the athlete will sit in behind and sit on their back pocket, and then what this means is that the other thigh ends up behind the body as opposed to this position where the thigh is in front or coming in front as we're creating ground contact. So if we then, our ability, what we've then put down is only fractionally returned, which is forcing the athlete's hips down into the space, and then they get stuck there, which goes all the way through the system and it compresses. And then what happens with that, in the next stride and the subsequent stride, they can't get out of that because of gravity and speed. It's the physics of the movement. So when this ankle collapses and the knee collapses and we create this deformation, the energy that was supposed to return and come back to help the athlete go forward is gone. Okay, so in both these conditions here, we have the same amount of force, but completely different speed coming out. And coaches miss this because they're watching the sprint and not the contact. They see an athlete who looks like they're working hard but going nowhere. And then they prescribe more force work, more gym sessions, more strength, when the problem was never the force. It's what happened to it on the way through. So start assessing ground contact compliance alongside force output, because producing force and returning it are two completely different skills, and your athletes need both. So now that we've got force production and elasticity sorted, and the instinct is to start to fix technique. But that's where most coaches make their biggest mistake. So force, elasticity, and now the one that every coach goes to first, even though it should come last, technique. And look, technique does matter, but the way most coaches approach it is completely backwards, and it's why their technical coaching rarely sticks. And I had this problem, information overload. Look at me, I'm the coach and I'm smart. And so here's what typically happens. The coach will watch an athlete sprint, they'll identify 10 technical problems, racking their brain for all their checklists, then they'll pick the most obvious one and will spend the next 3 sessions trying to fix it with the cues and drills. And for a day or two, maybe it improves. Then the next session comes around and it's gone, back to square one. And the coach tries again with a different cue and a different drill, same result. This isn't a coaching problem, it's a biology problem. So look at this diagram. On one axis, we've got the load or the dose of the intervention of the coaching cue. And on the other axis, we actually have the retention of the skill learning. This is fundamental skill acquisition. So what happens when you've got a beginner athlete, they're going to do the cue, they're going to do it well. We give them a dose, okay, of a cognitive load, but what happens is because of their lack of mastery, they have a significantly high rate of forgetting. They'll come up to one session and be like, what do we do? I don't even remember what that exercise was called. So what this shows you is that athletes forget the technical information almost immediately, but their nervous system doesn't have the physical foundation to retain the skill because the force qualities and the ground contact management underneath it aren't developed yet. You're trying to build the roof before the walls are up. But as speed age increases, as force dominance improves, and as ground contact compliance improves, the rate of forgetting will start to level out. So they're getting a greater retention of the skill. Okay? Technical coaching actually starts to land at this point now the athlete has the physical capabilities to assess the skill. So it's really important just to stop leading with technique and let your exercise selection do the teaching for you. So develop the force qualities, improve ground contact management, and technique improves naturally because the athlete now has the physical foundations to express it. This is known as dynamical systems theory. If we pick the right task and we give the athlete the right environment to do it, it's going to do the coaching for us. And inside the Sport Speed system, I use a framework called the Learn, Load, Execute, where we teach one part of the movement. We then load that part of the movement to reinforce it, and then we ask the athlete to perform that specific part of the movement as a rehearsal, and we cycle through that loop to beat this rate of forgetting and also develop the physical qualities at the same time. It works so well. And these qualities, force, elasticity and technique, if you get those right for each athlete, and speed stops being something that happens by accident. So let's all bring it together. What makes someone actually faster? It's not more drills, it's not more gym sessions, it's not more technical cues shouted across the field. It's these three simple qualities. Force produced quickly and in the right direction. Elasticity and reactivity, managing and returning ground contact energy instead of letting it leak out through deformation. And technique, not coached directly but developed naturally as the physical qualities underneath it improve. And here's the thing that ties it all three together. Most coaches are trying to fix the output, the sprint, the time, the technique, without ever addressing the inputs that produce it. That's why athletes plateau. That's why the strongest athletes aren't always the fastest. And that's why more training without the right focus just produce more trained athletes and not fast ones. So now you know the three levers. The next question is the one every coach asks once they've got this. How often should my athletes actually be sprinting? Because the answer isn't what most coaches think. And getting it wrong is one of the fastest ways to undo everything we've just covered. And that's exactly what episode 5 is going to cover. How often should your athlete sprint? By level, by sport, by time of the season. Simple guidelines that actually work in the real world. So make sure you watch the next video.